In this lecture, we discuss the Free Exercise Clause, accommodation of religious practice, and destruction of sacred sites. As seen in prior lectures, many tribal lifeways are anchored in a sense of connectedness to nature. Many tribes have sacred sites, geographic locations of spiritual and cultural significance, because they are places of origin or they are central to ceremonies. As a result of federal Indian policy, though, tribes have lost possession of much of their historic territory, so sacred sites are often outside of reservation boundaries. Especially in the western United States, many sacred sites are now on federally owned lands. There are two constitutional issues that arise when tribal members seek to access those sacred sites. One, to what extent must the government protect the Indians' free exercise of religion? And two, if the government tries to protect or accommodate the Indians' free exercise of religion, to what extent is the government limited in doing so by the Establishment Clause? We focus on the first of those matters today, and we will discuss the second in our next lecture. The primary case addressing Native Americans' access to sacred sites is Ling versus Northwest Indian Cemetery Protective Association. Ling involved a challenge to a federal project that would connect two Northern California towns with a paved road in support of a U.S. Forest Service project that over an 80-year period would extract about 733 million board feet of timber. The 75-mile road would run through the Six Rivers National Forest, and the Forest Service had completed the two end segments, leaving only a 6-mile segment in the Chimney Rock area, which is central to the religious practices of the Yurok, Karok, and Tolowa tribes. Pursuant to the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, the Forest Service commissioned an independent study to examine the environmental and cultural impacts of the project. In 1979, the commission concluded that the road would cause serious and irreparable damage to the sacred areas. Therefore, the commission recommended that the road project not be completed. In 1982, the Forest Service rejected that recommendation and selected a route that avoided archaeological sites and left about a half-mile between the road and ceremonial sites. The plaintiffs challenged this action, and they won in the District and Ninth Circuit courts. The lower courts found that this project would violate tribal members' free exercise rights under the First Amendment of the Constitution. The Supreme Court started with the text of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The Free Exercise Clause bars the government from coercing or regulating religious belief under any circumstances, but allows regulation of conduct or practices so as to burden religion under some circumstances. The court used a three-part test. First, is there a substantial burden on religion? If the answer is no, then the government action is constitutional and we move no further through our three-part test. If the answer is yes, though, then the government action is subject to strict scrutiny and we move on to the next two questions. Second, is the action justified by a compelling government interest? And third, if it is justified by a compelling government interest, is the action narrowly tailored to achieve that interest? All of the parties agreed that the projects would have devastating effects on traditional religious practices. Justice O'Connor wrote that the consequences were extremely grave. Nevertheless, the court held there was no substantial burden, so it didn't proceed to the second and third parts of our inquiry. The court reached its conclusion that there was no substantial burden, as a matter of law, even if there was a burden in fact, by narrowly construing the question and then tying it to belief. The majority noted that there was no penalty here tied to religious practice, and the government denied no benefit of citizenship. In other words, because there was no coercion of belief, there was no legally cognizable burden. The virtual destruction of the tribe's ability to practice their religion was a mere incidental effect, according to the court. Justice O'Connor emphasized that these were federal lands, and the court was reluctant to apply what it described as a religious servitude or religious easement that would limit the federal government in the use of its own land. Adding the slippery slope argument, the court asked, if we allow this restraint, what other restraints on the use of government land might be required? The court also noted that the government can and must accommodate religious practices, and it emphasized the Forest Service efforts to do so, to mitigate the harm by avoiding archaeological sites and creating a buffer between the road and places of worship. Finally, the court addressed the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978, in which Congress articulated the policy of protecting and preserving American Indians' inherent right of freedom to believe, express, and exercise their traditional religions, including, but not limited to, access to sites, use and protection of sacred objects, and freedom to worship in ceremonial and traditional rites. The Ling majority said that the legislative history makes clear that the statute has no teeth in it, but is merely a policy statement with no enforcement mechanism, and that it creates no private right of action against the government. Justice Brennan's dissent, joined by Justices Marshall and Blackmun, focused on the effect of government action, not on the nature of the government action in terms of its intent to coerce belief. Brennan emphasized that what matters is whether the action has the effect of burdening religious practice rather than coercing belief. Coercing belief is the precursor question. The government can't do that at all. If they're not coercive, then the question is, are they substantially burdening religion? Ultimately, the road was never finished because Congress protected the area before the Forest Service cured defects in its plan that violated the Clean Water Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. 2 years after the Ling decision, the Supreme Court decided Employment Division of Oregon versus Smith, holding that the government may burden the exercise of religion with a valid and neutral law of general applicability. Beyond the congressional responses to the Smith decision, in 1996, President Clinton issued Executive Order 13,007, directing federal agencies as follows. In managing federal lands, each executive branch agency with statutory or administrative responsibility for the management of federal lands shall, to the extent practicable, permitted by law, and not clearly inconsistent with essential agency functions, 1. Accommodate access to and ceremonial use of Indian sacred sites by Indian religious practitioners, and 2. Avoid adversely affecting the physical integrity of such sacred sites. Where appropriate, agencies shall maintain the confidentiality of sacred sites. Agencies were also directed to provide notice when activities may affect sacred sites. However, the order expressly states that it does not create a cause of action against the United States or its officers. In the next lecture, we will discuss the limits imposed by the Establishment Clause when the government tries to accommodate Native American religion on federal lands.